Reagan, who had been the chairman of Wall Street firm Merrill Lynch before coming to government, knew bupkis about foreign policy. He relied principally on the president's national security advisor, Robert
I don't trust people who have paintings of themselves.
McFarlane, to handle everything related to foreign affairs. Reagan was also being manipulated from an entirely different angle. He listened a lot to his wife, Nancy Reagan, who exerted a tremendous amount of control behind the scenes of the White House. Nancy
Yo, is Nancy Reagan a honeypot? What's going on?
had her own chief advisor, a celebrity astrologer named Joan Quigley.
Okay, that's how you know. That's how you know it's the Zio connections are pulling up. Astro fucking astrologer? Really? Come on.
Whom she consulted frequently. Quigley would look into the stars and tell Mrs. Reagan which days were quote-unquote favorable for her husband to make big policy decisions. Quigley's
Insane.
influence on the Reagan White House was kept a carefully guarded secret for years. Now, if this all sounds nuts, it should. Reagan knew about the astrologer, but he couldn't do anything about it. His boss listened to his wife, and she listened to Joan. Reagan was intent on controlling access to the president, mainly so he could manipulate the decisions that were being made. If anything got done in terms of foreign policy, it wasn't because any sort of formal decision got made. The logjam between Schultz and Weinberger typically prevented that, but it would be because Robert McFarlane, the national security advisor, would make an end run around them and get the president to do what he, McFarlane, wanted. In short, the Reagan White House by the middle of 1985 was a pretty dangerous place, where good policy decision-making processes went to die. If you're getting the impression that the Iran-Contra affair is going to involve Ronald Reagan's advisors doing stuff behind his back without telling him, and then backstabbing each other to get a bigger piece of the action, you're absolutely right. That is exactly where this is going. Before we get to the arms deals, let's delve into one final piece of context. That requires a rather radical shift of venue, from Washington, D.C. to the rainforests of Central America, specifically Nicaragua, by way, rhetorically speaking, of Southeast Asia. Ronald Reagan, as you recall, entered politics in the 1960s, when American involvement in the Vietnam War was ramping up. He was also a staunch Cold Warrior and anti-communist. His central obsession was the very old Cold War idea that the Soviet Union was a giant octopus, extending its tentacles everywhere it could in the world and ultimately trying to foment a world socialist revolution. This kind of thinking straight out of the
Lol.
1950s was the main assumption that led the United States into Vietnam. You may have
This was all propaganda, by the way.
heard of the domino theory. This was the idea that if one country in Southeast Asia turned communist, eventually all of them would. This idea justified vast expenditures of blood and treasure to prevent U.S. ally South Vietnam from uniting with communist North Vietnam. That it didn't end up going so well. The Vietnam War killed 58,000 Americans and more than 1 million Vietnamese, and in the end, all of Vietnam did go communist, which strangely did not prove to be the end of the world. Let's shift now from Southeast Asia to Central America. Even before the Cold War, this region had long been a playground for U.S. governments and business interests to throw their weight around. And the fight against communism, post-1945, made that tendency even worse. Whenever it looked like a left-wing or even left-leaning regime might come to power in any South or Central American country, the United States got very, very nervous. Cuba, after all, had become a Soviet client state after a leftist revolution overthrew the US-backed government there in 1959. If you believed in domino theory in Southeast Asia, chances are pretty good that you believe the same thing applied in Central America. Did go communist. Cold War did go communist, which strangely did not prove to be the end of the world. Let's shift now from Southeast Asia to Central America. Even before the Cold War, this region had long been a playground for U.S. governments and business interests to throw their weight around. And the fight against communism, post-1945, made that tendency even worse. Whenever it looked like a left-wing or even left-leaning regime might come to power in any South or Central American country, the United States got very, very nervous. Cuba, after all, had become a Soviet client state after a leftist revolution overthrew the US-backed government there in 1959. If you believed in domino theory in Southeast Asia, chances are pretty good that you believe the same thing applied in Central America too. This was why Ronald Reagan was really scared of what happened in Nicaragua. In 1979, after a revolution and a bloody civil war, a party called the FSLN came to power in Nicaragua. The FSLN was a socialist party, commonly called the Sandinistas, named after a guerrilla hero who died in the 1930s, and they revolted against the right-wing government of Anastasio Somoza, who had been backed by the US until Carter ended his support for him. Leftist guerrillas fighting right-wing governments, often backed by the US, was a common thing in Central America. It was also happening in El Salvador, going through its own bloody civil war, and also Guatemala. The CIA was deeply involved in these countries, often running covert operations to disrupt the leftist guerrilla factions. American policymakers tended to see Central America as black and white, democracy versus communism, that kind of Cold War struggle, thereby missing all the nuance of what was really going on.
It is time now for the people of the United States to unite with President Reagan to reverse the trends in Central America. Will you back President Reagan and make your voice heard for peace through strength by signing this resolution?
When Reagan came to power in 1981, he was alarmed at the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. A strong believer in domino theory, Reagan desperately wanted to take the Sandinistas out to prevent, as he saw it, all of Central America eventually going communist. But Congress, controlled by Democrats, who by 1981 generally didn't believe in domino theory anymore, didn't see it that way. When the FSLN, the Sandinistas, flipped Nicaragua in 1979, the opposition to them became the guerrilla force within that country. They were known as the Contras, but they weren't that unified. In fact, there were three major factions within the Contras that were constantly squabbling with each other. In 1981, the CIA started supplying weapons to the Contras and helped them run covert operations against the Sandinista government. Predictably, they did not tell Congress about any of these operations. The head of the CIA under Reagan was William Casey, the same guy who had managed his 1980 campaign and who was involved in the botched effort to get Ford on the ticket. A veteran of World War II espionage operations, Casey was himself an unreconstructed Cold Warrior who wanted to take a hard line against communism and thought Congress and the democratic process just gummed up the works. And Casey loved covert operations.
I love covert operations
too. The administration and the CIA were going to get the U.S. pulled into another Vietnam-style quagmire, passed a law officially banning the United States from giving military aid to the Contras. This law was popularly known as the Boland Amendment. Fear of another Vietnam wasn't the only motivating factor. The Contras themselves were, in fact, pretty horrible, routinely assassinating civilians, including priests and healthcare workers, engaging in torture, and committing numerous human rights violations. The Reagan administration, like most U.S. administrations, turned a blind eye to these abuses because it thought that the ends justified the means. Preventing communism from taking over Central America was, to them, worth the carnage, a rather cynical view. Reagan was incensed that Congress had cut off military aid to the Contras. He really, really wanted to keep backing them. In fact, this was his pet cause. Advisors said that mere mention of the Contras caused Reagan to, quote, go bananas. With the U.S. government, and particularly the CIA, banned from helping them, enterprising officials in Reagan's government started to think up new ways to keep the lifeline going for Reagan's pet cause. One of the ways they did this was to get other countries to give money to the Contras on the unspoken assumption that this would buy favorable treatment from Ronald Reagan. For example, in early 1985, Robert McFarlane got the government of Saudi Arabia to donate $24 million to the Contras.
What?
He also hit up wealthy private citizens in the United States and directed those funds secretly to the Contras.
What?
The official in charge of doing this sort of thing was a Marine lieutenant colonel named Oliver North. A Vietnam veteran who predictably felt the U.S. effort in that war had been sabotaged by liberals at home, North had a lot of baggage left over from that conflict. Though still a Marine, he went to work for the National Security Agency in 1981. There, he was involved in various covert operations. We're still not sure exactly what, because they were, of course, covert, and also because North had a tendency to exaggerate his accomplishments. For example, embellishing his role in the 1983 U.S. invasion of the small Caribbean island of Grenada. Concerning Nicaragua, North's job was basically to run and fund a secret war on behalf of the Contras, a war that the U.S. government was technically prohibited legally from supporting. Just so you know, North was not doing this entirely on his own. He was an employee of the National Security Agency, an organization run out of the White House, not accountable directly to Congress or any cabinet-level agency. North's direct boss was Admiral John Poindexter, the Deputy National Security Advisor. His boss was Robert McFarlane, who reported directly to President Reagan. At this time, 1985, there's no evidence that Ronald Reagan even knew who Oliver North was. Oh, I should mention something else because, you guessed it, it becomes important later. All these National Security Agency guys are communicating with each other via computer on a brand new system of interlinked systems called PROFS, or Professional Office System. Basically, email. The whole concept of email was brand new in 1985, and the National Security Agency was using it because they thought it was super secure. Foreshadowing? Anyway, back to Oliver North. North was in charge of sending private funds to them and then helping them buy the stuff they needed. Fancy toys like helicopters.
Why is Saudi Arabia helping so much?
Bullets and rifles and uniforms. North's little scheme went by a couple of names, such as the Enterprise and also Project Democracy. It had secret Swiss bank accounts to shift money around without being noticed. North was also able to use, off the record of course, CIA tools to get the stuff he needed to the Contras. Example, the CIA had its own private airline called Southern Air Transport that operated secret flights into Central America from various points of origin, often dropping pallets of weapons or supplies for the Contras that had been purchased by Project Democracy. A man named Richard Secord, a former Air Force officer with extensive experience in covert operations, and his business partner, Albert Hakim, were involved in these logistics. Remember that, it becomes important later.
Albert Hakim? What is that name?
A secret war in Central America, officially illegal, funded off the books, run by NSA personnel.
What? What? Yeah, basically dating back the era of the Shah of Iran. Before that, he was a close associate and business partner of Richard Secord, a retired U.S. Air Force general. He and the Secord formed a private company called Stanford Technology Trading Group International and a network of secret accounts and shell companies nicknamed the Enterprise was covert financial infrastructure that handled the secret arms sales to Iran and funneled money. What? Directly with Iranian officials, including a relative of the powerful Iranian Speaker of Parliament, Hashemi Rafsanjani. What? What? Oh shit. Wow. Formula was officially authorized, including promises about U.S. policy towards Iran, the release of prisoners. When this came to light, it deeply embarrassed Reagan administration because a private citizen had essentially been making foreign policy commitments on behalf of the United States. Yeah. Pleaded guilty in 1989 to supplementing the salary of Oliver North. Oh shit. A government which was illegal. He was given 2 years probation and fined. Wow, well that's pretty light. He also agreed to give up any claim of 1.7 million that was sitting in one of the enterprise accounts. One of he cooperated extensively with prosecutors and correctional investigators. That's insane, dude. Private individuals with the right connection can become deeply. I didn't know we had a fucking Iranian Epstein. That's insane. This is literally the definition of Epstein minus the, island. Essentially running a shadow foreign policy operation for profit while also serving the ideological goals of the officials who used him. He made millions from the arms deal while also genuinely believing he was helping free American hostages and supporting the Contras against communism. He largely faded from public view after the Iran-Contra investigation and died in 2003. Do I even want to go down that rabbit hole?
In 3 minutes, yes, 3 minutes, Reagan made the snap decision to offer the VP spot to George.
Wait. Am I tripping? No.
Specific approval. When the Israelis trying to put together the deal requested this approval, shift money around without being noticed. Chapter. On June 17, 1985, while the TWA 847 thing was still going on, Robert McFarlane wrote often called Southern Bank scheme went by a couple of names, such as the Enterprise, and also via computer. And she was using it because they thought it was super of sending privately raised funds to them and then helping them buy the stuff they needed. Fancy toys like helicopters and missiles, and then basic stuff like bullets and rifles and uniforms. North's little scheme went by a couple of names, such as the Enterprise, and also Project Democracy. It had secret Swiss bank accounts to shift money around without being noticed. North was also able to use, off the record of course, CIA tools to get the stuff he needed for his secret features that had been in covert operations, and his business partner, Albert Hakim, were a former Air Force officer with extensive experience in covert operations. Project Democracy points of origin, often dropping pallets of weapons or supplies for the Contras that had been purchased by Project Democracy. A man named Richard Secor, a former Air Force officer with extensive experience in covert operations, and his business partner, Albert Hakim, were involved in these logistics. Remember that, it becomes important later. I'm getting tired of saying that. So you got all this, a secret war in Central America, officially illegal, funded off the books, run by NSA personnel, including Oliver North, occasionally borrowing CIA assets to make it all work. What could possibly go wrong? Now, finally, after all this context, we get to the arms deals. That's the next chapter.
Fire.
On June 17, 1985, while the TWA 847 thing was still going on, Robert McFarlane wrote a memo to the rest of the National Security Council suggesting that the United States reach out to Iran in the hopes of building a relationship with more moderate elements who might be willing to deal with what Khomeini called the Great Satan. McFarlane suggested that a carrot they might offer the Iranians was, quote, selected military equipment. The memo got a big belly laugh from both Secretary of State George Shultz and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, who uncharacteristically agreed with each other. They both thought it was nuts. There were no quote-unquote moderates in Iran's government, they thought, and in any event, the idea of selling weapons to a state sponsor of terrorism was against one of Reagan's most firmly held policies. A couple of weeks later, on July 3rd, 1985, a former Israeli intelligence officer named David Kimchi and a few other Israelis met with McFarlane and had a suggestion. They told McFarlane that these mythical moderate elements did exist, and they could possibly get to them by using as a go-between a man named Manucher Ghorbanifar, an international arms dealer. Ghorbanifar had been born in Iran and left at the time of the revolution, but Kimchi and the Israelis said he knew some of these moderates. They'd talk with the U.S., possibly even about pressuring terrorist groups to release hostages if the U.S. sold them 100 anti-tank missiles.
Holy!
Fingerprints off the sale. The missiles would be transferred from Israel, not the United States. Israel bought most of its weapons from the U.S. McFarlane reported the meeting to Reagan, who seemed agreeable to letting McFarlane open negotiations with Ghorbanifar. The matter was discussed again a few weeks later. This meeting proved problematic because it happened in Ronald Reagan's hospital room just after he had surgery for colon cancer. It was never clear exactly what he agreed to in this meeting, or perhaps more importantly, what others, including McFarlane and Donald Regan, thought he agreed to. Under existing law, Israel could not transfer weapons of American manufacture to a third country without the United States' specific approval. When the Israelis trying to put together the deal requested this approval in early August, there was another meeting at the White House.
Why is Israel trying to sell weapons, American weapons, to Iran? For the release of prisoners? That doesn't make sense.
Again, both Schultz and Weinberger were uncharacteristically united in agreement that this whole thing was a terrible idea. No decision was made at this meeting. But a few days later, McFarlane said that President Ronald Reagan called him on the phone and told him to go ahead. There's no evidence other than McFarlane's word that this is actually how it happened. The White House had no record of the call being made. Reagan said later that he couldn't remember it. That's going to become a thing in this story, Reagan saying he doesn't remember something. On August 20th, 1985, Israel shipped about 90 TOW missiles, anti-tank missiles, to Iran. The actual supposed three-way deal between Iran, Israel, and the U.S., brokered by Ghorbanifar, who collected a big commission, naturally, called for 500 missiles to swap for all the hostages. When Israel sent the first 90 missiles or so, Ghorbanifar told McFarlane that the Iranians were waiting for the other 400 before releasing any hostages. McFarlane, curiously not smelling a rat in this deal, agreed. On September 15th, Israel shipped another 408 missiles to Iran. Kimchi, the Israeli, then called McFarlane and said, well, we kind of made a mistake. The people we're dealing with in Iran don't...
Oh, yeah, they don't want to hold hands?
Yeah.
That's so awkward, bro.
don't have the
Yeah,
power
they
to
are
release
both
all the
Zios.
hostages, but they might release one. One hostage was released, Benjamin Wheat.
What?
I'd be surprised if Amelie isn't a Zionist. He's like,
Oh, I thought they're both Jews. Aren't they both Jewish?
but I wonder if I know Sam Altman is definitely Zionist.
No, they're both Zio, bro. They're all Zios. Like, all the people who hate each other in America, one thing they agree on is Israel.
Who appeared on a release, then called McFarlane and said, well, we kind of made a mistake. The people we're dealing with in Iran don't have the power to release all the hostages, but they might release one. One hostage was released, Benjamin Weir, who appeared on a street in Beirut the same day,
What?
September 15th. But that was it. McFarlane kept hoping that the Iranians would release someone else. They didn't. The whole thing was basically a swindle. Expecting all
What?
7 hostages freed, they only got one, and it cost 500 TOW missiles.
What?
Ghorbanifar, however, pressed for more. Now he told McFarlane that Iran wanted a different kind of missile, Hawk missiles, more expensive, but they, meaning the Iranians, could get the rest of the hostages out and without Khomeini from finding out about it. Ghorbanifar also
What?
hinted that if the missile deals didn't continue, the terrorists holding American hostages in Lebanon would kill them. In reality, they never made this threat. Ghorbanifar, who made sweet bank on commissions on the arms deals, was self-interested to keep them going. As
What?
Israel got involved again in this second deal, the Israeli government, which agreed to transfer the Hawks, pressed McFarlane for a guarantee that the U.S. would replenish Israel's supply of Hawk missiles after the transfer. These requests hit at a bad time. Reagan was at the time in Geneva, Switzerland, for the first of his famous summit meetings with this new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Once again, it's not clear who exactly agreed to what. But in Geneva, Schultz got wind of the plan and blew up, recognizing that it definitely was arms for hostages. But McFarlane interpreted the will of Ronald Reagan as deeming him to go ahead. But because he was busy working on that summit meeting, McFarlane delegated the operational details of the transfer to Oliver North. Now, for some reason I don't fully understand, the plane full of missiles left Israel and was supposed to land in Lisbon, Portugal, before going on to Tehran. But the Portuguese authorities refused permission for the plane to go on. That plane had to turn around and return to Israel. North, who apparently believed all the remaining hostages would be sprung at this time, scrambled to find a replacement aircraft. To get one, he turned to Richard Secord, with whom he'd worked previously on various Contra operations, to get a plane, which had previously been used to drop stuff off for the Contras. This plane was used to take missiles in Israel and fly them to Tehran. Secord was really good at this kind of thing, so this is exactly what he did. Now, this was an issue because in order to use CIA assets, which Secord was involved with, the National Security Agency, which North worked for, had to have what was called a finding, a document addressed to Congress that explained what was going on. There was no finding for this Hawk missile shipment, which went to Iran thanks to Secord's help on November 25th, 1985.
Insane.
For his part, running true to form, Ghorbanifar did the Charlie Brown's football thing again. He told McFarlane after the missiles got to Iran that the Iranians were pissed because they were first the wrong kind of missile and they even still had Israeli markings on them. In fact, they were so pissed that they refused to release any more hostages. McFarlane was now at wit's end. Not only was this Iran thing blowing up in his face, but he thought Donald Regan, who hated him, was spreading rumors throughout Washington that McFarlane, who was married, was having an affair with a Washington reporter. McFarlane also struggled with depression. On December 4th, 1985, he resigned as National Security Advisor. Honestly, you can't blame him, but this was the wrong time to change horses. McFarlane's replacement was his former deputy, John Poindexter. And the very day that McFarlane threw in the towel, North, who was eager to impress his new boss, wrote a huge memo outlining a bold and broadened plan for the Iran hostage initiative. North proposed to swap over 3,000 missiles to Iran directly, without Israel as an intermediary, in exchange for all the remaining American hostages, plus a French hostage. In this memo, North also included the imaginary threat invented by Ghorbanifar that the hostages would be killed if the U.S. turned off the deals. In the meantime, the CIA, in order to solve the whole problem about having done the November 25th missile shipment without a finding,
No wonder they're so
drafted one
pissed.
that would cover the shipment retroactively, which also notably and illegally said that Congress shouldn't be informed. On December 6, 1985, Poindexter brought this paper to Reagan. He signed it without reading it. Later, Reagan would say he couldn't remember signing it, and in any event, months later, Poindexter tore up the only copy of it. The day after that, December 7th, the National Security Council met specifically to discuss the Iran initiative. But this meeting was curiously incomplete. McFarlane, who was no longer National Security Advisor but still in the loop, led the meeting. But he did not address the shipment that had just gone through, and he carefully avoided any mention of the finding that Reagan had signed the day before. Schultz and Weinberger were there, George Bush was not. Weinberger warned Reagan that this whole thing was an awful idea. Schultz also blew up at it all over again. Typically for his management style, Reagan didn't make any final decision, except he seemed to McFarlane and Poindexter to agree that further talks should go ahead with Ghorbanifar to see if the Iranians could be persuaded to release any hostages without getting weapons first. In actuality, at the very time this meeting was held, Oliver North was already in Europe negotiating with Ghorbanifar
So the
for more
president was
weapons.
being lied to.
One last thing about these early deals. When North was scrambling around trying to find a plane to take that November shipment of missiles to Iran, and when he got Secord involved, $1 million of money that Israel transferred to the United States, part of the payment for the missiles, was shunted into one of North's Project Democracy accounts, one of his Swiss bank accounts. This was done in case Secord needed some money to facilitate the transfer, in other words, bribes. Well, it turned out that Secord didn't need to use much of this fund. After the shipment was over, there was $850,000 of this money left. North, who thought it was just surplus money, transferred it to one of the Contra accounts. That was the first time that money had been diverted from the Iran arms sales to the Contras. And at the time, it was kind of an afterthought, but it would definitely prove not to be the last diversion. Because it looked like Iran-Contra account 50,000 states, North was scrambling around trying to find a plane to take that November shipment of missiles to Iran, and when he got Secord involved, $1 million of money that Israel transferred to the United States, part of the payment for the missiles, was shunted into one of North's Project Democracy accounts, one of his Swiss bank accounts. Thought that Secord didn't need to use much of this needed to one of North's Project Democracy. There was 800 accounts to the Contras. Because it looked like they were going to do a newer, bigger, more missile-y version of the Iran initiative, as per North's December 4th memo, the National Security Council needed a finding, not retroactive this time, to approve it. On January 6, 1986, Poindexter drafted one and brought it to President Reagan in advance of a meeting that was supposed to happen the next day. Reagan didn't realize that the document was a draft, not a final version. He went ahead and signed it. Apparently, that was not unusual. He signed just about everything his advisors put in front of him, sometimes without reading the documents first. So, that next day, January 7th, 1986, the full National Security Council met to discuss the whole Iran thing. This time, everybody important was there, including George Bush and CIA Director William Casey. Just as they had before, Schultz and Weinberger on the same side tore into it. Everybody else thought it was a fantabulous idea, including, and perhaps especially, Bush. In later years, when pressed on Iran-Contra, Bush repeatedly minimized his input at this meeting. Casey was also enthusiastic. This despite the fact that he knew Ghorbanifar had spectacularly failed a polygraph test he was given and was known to be a liar and exaggerator. It was clear that Reagan wanted to go ahead. He was especially motivated by the idea that the lives of the hostages were at stake if they didn't continue the deals. Donald Regan, chief of staff, who had been opposed to the idea the first couple times it was mentioned, was now suddenly all for it, probably because he realized Reagan was for it. The key thing about this new plan was that in future shipments, the weapons would not go through Israel. Ghorbanifar would still make his commission as the broker, but Israel wouldn't have to be cut in on anything. Oliver North figured out that the CIA could buy, in quotes, the missiles from the Department of Defense for a $2.5 million profit. On January 17, 1986, Poindexter brought President Reagan a new finding approving the arms sales going forward, a final one, not the draft that he'd mistakenly signed January 6th. Tellingly, Reagan, who kept a diary of his time at the White House, wrote this in his journal on that day, quote, "I agreed to sell TOWs to Iran," end quote. After meeting with Ghorbanifar again in London on January 24, 1986, North wrote another grandiose memo. In many ways, this is the most bizarre document in the whole Iran-Contra story. Gaseous and overblown even by North standards, the document proposed a detailed timeline for Operation Recovery, involving transfers of money, missiles being flown from point A to point B, and secret meetings at the Churchill Hotel in London. This is the Churchill Hotel in London, by the way, now the Hyatt Regency. Perfect place for an arms deal, isn't it? The memo also specifies prisoner releases by Israel, payments of millions of dollars to Ghorbanifar, the date all U.S. hostages are to be released, February 9, 1986, and I don't know whether this was intended as a joke or not, but a prediction that Khomeini steps down as leader of Iran on February 11th, the anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. In February 1986, the wheels on the deals kept turning. The U.S. Army began turning over TOW missiles to the CIA. Ghorbanifar got bridge financing from a wealthy Saudi, Adnan Khashoggi, to broker the deal. This had happened before. And by the end of the month, 2 shipments totaling 1,000 missiles wound up in Iran. But like previous deals, it was a swindle. Contrary to North's careful timetable, no hostages were released, and Khomeini, of course, did not step down. Yet, astonishingly, despite being burned numerous times now, the Reagan administration officials continued to try to make deals. To be sure, they were egged on by Ghorbanifar, who kept making false and inflated promises. On April 3rd, 1986, Ghorbanifar met with Oliver North and some CIA agents at the Ramada Renaissance Hotel near Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. Ghorbanifar told the Americans that if a delegation came to Tehran bringing weapons with them, the Iranians would release all the rest of the hostages. After an all-night meeting, North wrote up a memo about what had been agreed to. Hold that thought. Not only is it important later, it's one of the key points of the whole story. Poindexter, though, North's boss, was losing patience with the whole thing. Ghorbanifar was clearly unreliable. In fact, not long after the April meeting, he was arrested in an unrelated sting operation. He, Poindexter, wanted North to tell the Iranians that they should fork over some hostages without getting weapons in advance. The NSC team was distracted in April by Ronald Reagan's airstrikes on Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, said to be retaliation for Gaddafi's sponsorship of terrorism. But by early May, the Tehran mission was on. Even though he wasn't National Security Advisor anymore, Robert McFarlane headed the mission. The whole thing was, after all, his baby. North was there, plus some CIA personnel, which I'm not going to name because there's already too many people in this story for you to keep track of. On the Iranian side, they had been told that they would be meeting with Ali Rafsanjani, the Speaker of Iran's parliament, and also Ali Khamenei, the President of Iran. Both Ghorbanifar and North had pumped up the idea of the mission as the start of a brand new relationship between the U.S. and Iran. McFarlane and North even brought a cake with them, shaped like a key, to symbolize the key to better relations. They also brought a bunch of spare parts for the TOW missiles that they had already delivered, and another plane full of missiles was waiting in Tel Aviv to be dispatched on McFarlane's order. The Tehran mission went off the rails from the word go. No one came to meet them at the Tehran airport, at least not at first. Finally, Ghorbanifar turned up, as well as Ahmed Kangardu, the official buyer of arms for the Iranian government. I apologize for butchering the Persian names there, but not the top officials that they were expecting. They took the Americans to the top floor of the Estekial Hotel, which in the Shah's time was the Tehran Hilton. By all accounts, the Tehran meeting was a disaster. Several people who claimed to be Iranian government officials did show up, but they used fake names and their credentials were unverifiable. Once Ghorbanifar was out of the room, McFarlane and North discovered that he lied to both sides about what the other had agreed to. He told Iranians that the Americans were bringing weapons, not just spare parts, and he told the Americans that the Iranians were going to release all the hostages. Neither was true. After some drama, which we don't really need to go into, the Americans left 2 days later totally empty-handed. No hostages, no deal, except for the spare parts on board the plane that they'd come to Tehran in, which the Iranian government paid for. McFarlane was bitterly disappointed. So was North. If the deal had gone through, the plane load of missiles waiting in Tel Aviv, if that had been delivered, it would have meant millions for the secret Contra project. In the meantime, Ghorbanifar, who had beat the rap on that sting operation, was desperate to keep the deals going on. After all, he made a big profit on each one of these deals, and he had to pay back his bridge financier, Adnan Khashoggi. Ghorbanifar warned the Iranians that they would lose the opportunity to deal for American weapons that they needed if they took too hard a line. Miraculously, on July 26, 1986, another hostage, Father Lawrence Jenko, was released in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. Just as a completely irrelevant aside, I once met Father Lawrence Jenko. He came to speak to our high school in 1988.
Wow.
Although the release of Jenko seemed to the Reagan administration like a miracle, the only miracle really going on was that anybody still believed in Ghorbanifar crap. He had taken it upon himself to tell Iran that the U.S. would agree to send the weapons that were supposed to have come on that plane from Tel Aviv back in May if Iran released a hostage right now. After Jenko's release, Casey, CIA director, urged Reagan to give something to Tehran as a reward for having released him. On North's written suggestion, they shipped some Hawk missile parts to Iran, which arrived on August 4, 1986. Negotiations continued throughout September and October, but it was clear by this point that the whole Iran arms deal initiative was a total mess, and no more hostages were released. After more than a year of shady deals, they had bought the release of only two Americans. But perhaps more importantly, at least for Oliver North, the arms deals that had gone through had resulted in hefty profits for Project Democracy, the secret Contra war. The diversion of funds from the arms sales to the Contra war was at the very heart of this scandal. That is in the next chapter.
What a fucking mess, bro. The American government is a mess.
It's difficult to tell exactly
Like a really bad mess.
And how the diversion began. The two people who knew the most about it, Oliver North and John Poindexter, weren't exactly trustworthy. The stories they told to Congress during the investigation of the Iran-Contra affair in the summer of 1987 were almost certainly false. When he testified to Congress...
What?
U.S. is great.
No, U.S. is great, but the government is a mess.
In July 1987, North claimed the idea for the diversion was hatched at the Churchill Hotel.
Bro, there's too much freedom in America, bro. Everybody just be doing whatever the fuck they want. Huh?
I heard a Korean guy say that. I think that's a super fascist way of thinking.
Dude, it's super fascist that in America everybody has enough power to like absolutely do political and international moves that has everybody else involved into it without them knowing. It's crazy. Like I'm watching this Contra thing and like a lot of like Ronald Reagan stuff comes in and dude, Ronald Reagan was just signing papers without reading them, and a lot of his advisors was just making deals on his behalf without even like telling him or lying to Reagan about it. And then on top of that, the people working under the advisors at some point had started making their own moves that were like on behalf of fucking of the advisors, essentially the president, without the president knowing about it, or the advisors. So at some point, you know, they were just swinging it.
During his meeting with Ghorbanifar in January 1986, and that it was Ghorbanifar idea. Ghorbanifar denied this, and he's probably right. North was lying. Remember the missile shipment of November 1985, the one that were the summer of 1987, were almost certainly false. When he testified to Congress in July 1987, North claimed that the idea for the diversion was hatched at the Churchill Hotel during his meeting with Ghorbanifar in January 1986, and that it was Ghorbanifar idea. Ghorbanifar denied this, and he's probably right. North was lying. Remember the missile shipment of November 1985?
Yeah, they're all fucking lying, dude.
Because the Portuguese authorities wouldn't let the plane load of missiles through? When North brought Secord on board to solve that one, $1 million was transferred in case Secord needed to bribe officials to get the plane to Iran. He didn't need it, or at least most of it, and...
What's the way for Iranian Foyd? Teach me, sir. You got it, you got it. I first need to know more about this Foyd. Depends. There's many different types of Foyds. How old is she? How long has she been in Iran? Where has she been educated? These things change the game slightly. And sounds like you want all of the advantages, all of the edges. So I need more info.
$850,000 of that fund was left over. North diverted that money to the Contras.
But
that seems to have been...
To be honest, you're witty enough. Just keep being witty and don't be an asshole. And you'll definitely be able to land it.
The very first diversion, and it was probably North's own idea. His day job, after all, when he...
Thing is, like, you know, Iranian girls don't take bullshit. Like, and they smell bullshit. Iranians culturally are good at smelling bullshit. So you better not bring bullshit into this relationship because they will not take it. You gotta be honest and logical. And the moment your logic does not make sense and your honesty is not clear, then they will tear into you. So, yeah.
Wasn't moonlighting.
And it's not like there's no room for mistakes. Of course you can make mistakes, but as long as you're honest about it and, you know, show improvement, then it'll be easy. If you just wanna like mess around, then that's a whole different ball game. I need more information if you just want to mess around though.
On the Iran missile deals was to drum up money and support for the Contras. He thought that money belonged not to the U.S. government, but to Ghorbanifar, the crooked arms dealer. He had no qualms about pinching it and giving it to the Contras. We know that he was doing it before January 1986, because the previous month, December 6, 1985, North told officials of the Israeli Ministry of Defense that he was going to use part of the proceeds from the sale to help the Contras. Poindexter said that North told him about the diversion for the first time in January 1986 after that Churchill Hotel meeting. Poindexter thought about it for a few minutes and decided, yeah, sure, go ahead. That is also probably false. It seems unlikely that Poindexter wouldn't have known about the diversions shortly after they began. North testified that he thought Reagan knew about the diversion. North had written a couple of memos throughout the process that mentioned it. We'll talk about one particular memo in a minute, and some of those memos he believed had gone to the president. But there was no evidence that Reagan had actually seen these memos. So, the big question, and the one at the heart of the whole Iran-Contra mess, is the obvious one. Did Reagan know about the diversion? Was it his idea? Did he order it? If he didn't, when did he first find out about it? When the whole Iran-Contra thing broke open in the fall of 1986, Reagan insisted to the public. And
Dude, every American president has a big ass scandal, dude. Fuck. And after every fucking scandal, the country just goes into a deeper hole, dude. Well, I wonder if Trump is as deep as the hole goes before you guys hit water and, it starts filling up the hole and drowning you.
to all investigators who ever asked that he knew nothing about the diversion. Was he lying? If so, he probably should have been impeached. If not, there was still something terribly wrong, because how could that have gone on in his White House, in his national security agency, without him knowing about it? This is where the Rorschach-like quality of Iran-Contra comes into play. If you see Reagan as a hero who could do no wrong, of course he didn't know, or it doesn't matter if he knew, because even if he did, it was totally okay and he did nothing wrong. If you see Reagan as a villain who could do no right, of course he lied and it was his idea in the first place, and it proves he was a Machiavellian and untrustworthy and crooked from the beginning.
I don't know, bro. It sounds like Reagan is just because this has a lot to do with foreign policy and stuff, and Reagan just wanted the hostages back, the Americans back. Kind of like, I guess all American presidents want their people back, right? That's one good quality they have. But Reagan wasn't really involved in foreign affairs, and this is all just foreign. He didn't seem to be interested, or neither was he in the right health or mindset to keep up. So I don't know if he's like the devil in this scenario, but he's definitely the fool.
Evidence. I believe that it points in the direction of Reagan not knowing about the diversion. As meaningful as it was in a political and constitutional sense, the diversion of Iranian weapons proceeds to the Contras fell to the level of operational detail, not broad-stroke policy or strategy. As we've seen, Reagan was extremely detached from the operational details of governance. He only stepped in at the broad-stroke level, and sometimes not even then. His presidency was hands-off. Perhaps
insane. Hands-off presidency is crazy. It seems like, I don't know, what doesn't make sense? Hands-off presidency? Like, what?
Detached from operational detail. The precept of Occam's razor tells us that all things being equal, the simplest explanation tends to be the truth. The simplest explanation is, here, I think, that the diversion was Oliver North's idea, and that he got it in November 1985, when he saw there was $850,000 in extra money sitting there after the Lisbon missile shipment. The only person exercising oversight over North was Poindexter, who loved the idea when North told him about it, and he certainly was not going to tell Reagan. Poindexter had to know this business was shady, but it was Ronald Reagan's pet project, and if any heads were to roll over it, he, Poindexter, would much rather it be his own than Ronald Reagan's. So I don't think he would have told him under any circumstances.
Damn, see? They're just fucking keeping secrets from the president. But also the president didn't even fucking care, dude. Damn, dude. I'm starting to see why Reagan won. Why Reagan had so much support.
How much money was diverted?
Because putting Reagan as the president allowed a lot of things to just go through.
Of a total of $16.1 million that Iran paid the United States for weapons in 19...
And we're just talking about the Iran-Contra, things. We're not even talking about all the things that, benefited Israel during Reagan.
85 and 86, investigators think at least $3.8 million went to the Contras. The idea of the diversion came at exactly the right time. North's Project Democracy was running dry on funds, and ideas to get funds to supply the Contras. In fact, few, if any, shipments of supplies had been made to them by the end of 1985. This supports the hypothesis that the diversion was kind of a desperation move, a last-ditch effort to keep the secret Contra war alive. One of the ironies of the whole Iran-Contra affair is that for their part, the Iranians discovered the diversion, or at least got close to discovering it, even before most Americans did.
Damn.
On June 30th, 1986, Iranian officials discovered a price list relating to missiles and parts that they'd been buying for a year now. And they discovered from this list that Ghorbanifar had been overcharging them by a whopping 600%.
Damn!
Where's the rest of this money going? Furthermore, there's evidence that several people at the CIA knew or at least suspected that the diversion was going on, especially after North began organizing Contra supply flights in the spring of 1986, but no one spoke up about it. On April 1st, 1986, the secret effort to resupply the Contras, coordinated by Richard Secord, made its first illegal flight to drop supplies into the jungle. The meeting at the Ramada Renaissance Hotel in Washington between North, Ghorbanifar, and several CIA agents took place 2 days later. The next day, North wrote up a revised plan for future arms for hostages deals, titled Release of American Hostages in Beirut. It was North's usual elaborate spy movie fantasy of arms shipments, money transfers, and hostage releases, just like his ludicrous January 24th memo.
Crazy, dude.
But on page 5 of this memo, the last page, there was an unusual paragraph. It read, quote, 12 million will be used to purchase critically needed supplies for the Nicaraguan Democratic Resistance Forces. This materiel is essential to cover shortages in resistance inventories resulting from their current offensives and Sandinista counterattacks, and to bridge, in quotes, the period between now and when congressionally approved lethal assistance beyond the 25 million defensive arms can be delivered, end quote. That memo, since termed the diversion memo, came to light a couple of months later, on November 22nd, 1986, when Justice Department investigators found it in North's files. That paragraph was the bomb that blew up Ronald Reagan's presidency.
Amen. Insane.
Flights to the Contras, organized by Secord and funded by Oliver North's Project Democracy with Iran's money, started flying in early April 1986. The flights were conducted by the CIA's private airline, Southern Air Transport. They carried weapons expressly illegal under the Boland Amendment, and other humanitarian aid, not all of it quite so humanitarian, to Contra camps inside Nicaragua. On June 25th, 1986, Reagan's incessant lobbying of Congress to turn the tap of military aid to the Contras back on finally succeeded. The House voted for a $25 million aid package, but the authorization for military aid wouldn't start for a couple of months. North and Secord would keep the illegal supply operation going until then. On October 5th, 1986, one of Southern Air Transport's covert aircraft...
Can you guys believe this is 1.5 speed? It's one long-ass video. Let me see if 1.75 is even understandable.
A Fairchild C-123 provider was shot down over Nicaragua by a surface-to-air missile. The plane, full of weapons for the Contras, crashed in the jungle, killing everyone on board except for one CIA man, Eugene Hasenfuss, who was the only one with a parachute. He bailed out. Hasenfuss was captured by Sandinista troops, and a tape of his capture was broadcast on TV. He said to the cameraman, "My name is Eugene Hasenfuss. I come from Marinette, Wisconsin." From the point of view of the outside world, this was the beginning of the Iran-Contra scandal. In reality, it was the beginning of the end. At first, White House officials denied the Hasenfuss flight was part of a secret Contra mission. Even Reagan himself denied it at a press conference. 2 days after the shootdown, on October 7th, Oliver North tipped off by CIA.
Wait, so who shut down the plane?
One of Southern Air Transport for a $25 million aid package, but the authorization for military aid wouldn't start for a couple of months. North and Secord would keep the illegal supply operation going until then. On October 5th, 1986, one of Southern Air Transport's covert aircraft...
What's up with October, bro? There's so many things that happened in October. October surprise, airplane got shut down in October, October this, October that. What's up with October 7th? You know what I'm saying? Like, something about October, bro. A lot of things happened in October. It's kind of strange.
A Fairchild C-123 provider was shot down over Nicaragua by a surface-to-air missile. The plane, full of weapons for the Contras, crashed in the jungle, killing everyone on board, down over Nicaragua by a surface-to-air missile.
Over by
Nicaragua. Who was the only one with a parachute. He bailed out. Contra scandal. In reality, it was the beginning of the end. At first, White House officials denied that the Hasenfuss flight was part of a secret Contra mission. Even Reagan himself denied it at a press conference. 2 days after the shootdown, on October 7th, Oliver North, tipped off by CIA Director William Casey and North's own boss, John Poindexter, began shredding documents in his office pertaining to Project.
Damn, they started getting rid of evidence.
Called profs that the NSC was using. I told you it would be important. Someone on Poindexter's staff remembered that North had written a bunch of memos and emails related to various operations, both Contra and Iran. Poindexter had the wherewithal to order them deleted, but this was 1986, before anyone knew how email worked. Yes, what you're thinking right now is exactly right. Neither he nor anyone else on the NSC staff knew that copies of all the emails and documents were stored on the server. Just while the administration was dealing with about the secret aid to the Contra, incredibly, North was still putting together arms deals with Iran. He
fucking boomers, am I right?
Finally gotten a clue and got Ghorbanifar out of the picture and was now dealing directly with Iranian officials. On
Damn.
October 8th, 1986, another shipment of 500 TOW missiles went to Iran. Uncharacteristically, this one did result in the release of a hostage, David Jacobson, let loose on the streets of Beirut. North thought the Iranians promised more hostages, but typically none were forthcoming. The day after that, November 3rd, 1986, the final piece of the expose finally came. A Lebanese newspaper, Ash Shira, ran a small article detailing Robert McFarlane's secret mission to Tehran the previous spring, bringing weapons and trying to barter for the release of the remaining hostages. The story was leaked to the newspaper by an Iranian official opposed to the arms deals. If the Hassanfus shootdown had caused a minor blip in the world's press, the Ashura story caused a hurricane. Suddenly, the cover on the secret Iran arms initiative was blown. And at exactly the worst time. The next day, November 4th, was Election Day in the U.S.
Fucking hell, dude.
Exposure, Republicans lost the Senate for the first time in Ronald Reagan's presidency. Anticipating a political furor, the chief architects of the deals, McFarlane, North, Poindexter, and other members of the NSC staff, started...
What does political furor mean, though? Expecting your political furor?
Though probably not because of the exposure, Republicans lost the Senate for the first time in Ronald Reagan's presidency. Anticipating a political furor, the chief architects of the deals, McFarlane, North, Poindexter, and other members of the NSC staff, started writing down a detailed chronology of everything that had happened with the Iran arms deals, sort of a script that Reagan could work from when dealing with the press. There was just one thing, though. The chronology was deliberately inaccurate, and in some respects, outright false.
Another lie to their own fucking president. That's insane, dude.
NSC people were building their cover-up. At first, North thought the Iran initiative could survive the political firestorm. But on November 8th, the government of Iran made clear that there would be no deals for the release of further American hostages, unless the Al-Dawa prisoners being held captive in Kuwait, remember them, were released. Since this was one of the original demands made by Iran-connected terrorist groups when the whole hostage thing started back in 1984, basically they were back to square one. Working from incomplete information, some of it given to him by Poindexter, he gave a speech to the nation on November 19th, in which he insisted that the United States had not traded arms for hostages. He later followed this speech with a disastrous press conference in which he made several statements that various members of his administration, including Secretary of State George Shultz, knew to be false. Shultz, in fact, had a come-to-Jesus meeting with Reagan. Schultz, who, as you recall, opposed...
So essentially they got a fucking dumbass to be president so they can abuse the presidency power.
He was telling him things he didn't know. He, Schultz, didn't know very much. Something was terribly wrong. On November 20th, in advance of the testimony that was going to be given to Congress by CIA Director William Casey, Edwin Meese, Attorney General, decided that the White House had to know what everybody knew and had to get its story straight. So he, Meese, dispatched two informal Justice Department investigators, Reynolds and Richardson, to collect documents and talk to the principals, mainly North, Poindexter, and McFarlane. North was tipped off that the investigators were coming. North and his secretary, Fawn Hall, who incidentally was the daughter of Robert McFarlane's former secretary, had already begun destroying or altering documents earlier in the month. Beginning on Friday, November 21st, and continuing through the weekend, which was the weekend before Thanksgiving, they shifted into high gear. They fed reams of documents into a paper shredder, jamming it and eventually destroying it.
This has to be highly illegal, no? What the fuck?
Missing several key and telling details. Even
Wow.
as investigators were approaching their office,
It's
Hall,
just-
remembering documents that she had forgotten to destroy, stuffed
Isn't
them into
this
her
like
vest and the back of her blouse before she left the office.
Trading your
The
own
key moment was on
country,
Saturday,
like betraying your
November
own
22nd.
country?
Reynolds and Richardson were going through the documents they requested from North,
It's
the ones
insane.
that he hadn't shredded, altered, or had smuggled out of the office. North and Hall were pretty bad at destroying evidence because the Justice Department investigators found, voila, right there in black and white, the diversion memo of April 4th, and specifically the paragraph, the paragraph, the one that I quoted earlier. Any attempt at a cover-up was suddenly at an end. The Justice Department guys reported the memo to their boss, Ed Meese, Attorney General, who could only pray that it was just a proposal that hadn't been acted upon. On the other hand, it wasn't. Meese had no choice but to tell his boss, Ronald Reagan. The disclosure was made in the presence of the Chief of Staff, Donald Regan. He later said that he was sure, gauging from Reagan's reaction, that he hadn't known about the diversion. Reagan wasn't as good an actor as everyone thought he was. To his credit, Regan argued that they had to make it public as soon as possible. The only one who disagreed with that was Casey, who said, predictably, that the lives of the hostages might be at stake if they blabbed. No one was listening to Casey anymore by this time. Events followed fast and furious after that. Reagan called Oliver North at his office, now eerily quiet after years of buzzing activity. "You're a great American hero," Reagan said. It didn't change the fact that North was fired. Poindexter declared his resignation. Reagan made an appearance before the press.
Reagan is a
announcing
fool.
that the diversion had been discovered and that North and Poindexter had been cashiered. The press, of course, went bananas. On November 26, 1986, the day before Thanksgiving, Ronald Reagan appointed a special commission to investigate what had happened. This commission would be headed by former Texas Senator John Tower, and his was in addition to congressional committees that were already investigating. Reagan then went off to his ranch in California for the holiday. He seemed dazed. An aide remarked that it seemed like he was living in a dream world. On December 1st, a New York Times CBS News poll found that Ronald Reagan's approval rating had collapsed more than 20 percentage points in a single month. His living memory had lost much of his credibility with the public. On December 20th, just before the Christmas holidays, the cold open of Saturday Night Live, the guest that week was Star Trek actor William Shatner, featured a musical number in which Shatner portrayed Ollie North, the mute Marine. North, fearing criminal prosecution, had taken the Fifth Amendment in response to congressional questioning about the affair. For all of his talk of duty, at last, North's own interest for self-preservation had finally surfaced.
Wow.
Ronald Reagan was slow to react to the crippling damage that Iran-Contra had done to his presidency, but he did react. A Senate Select Committee released a report on the mess on January 29, 1987. The Tower Commission's report followed February 24th. Both told largely the same story. The Iran-Contra matter had occurred, they concluded, because of a failure to manage staff by the White House, which led ambitious underlings, such as Alden North and John Poindexter, to commit great wrongs in furtherance of what they perceived was the president's policy, and there was never a leash to pull them back. Robert McFarlane, Reagan's former national security advisor who had gotten everybody into this mess in the first place, blamed himself. Just before his scheduled testimony before the Tower Commission on February 9th, 1987, he tried to kill himself with a deliberate overdose of Valium. He survived. Another key player in the scandal wasn't so lucky. On December 15th, 1986, CIA Director William Casey suffered a seizure as a result of a brain tumor. He was hospitalized, he did not recover, and died on May 6th, 1987. Whatever he knew or did not know about Iran-Contra died with him. Recognizing that his own failure of leadership had caused the disaster, just after the Tower report came out, Reagan accepted the resignation of his chief of staff, Donald Regan, a move that Nancy had been urging for a long time. Despite screaming, "I deserve better treatment than this," Reagan eventually slinked out of the White House. Reagan replaced him with former Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker, who had been once one of the lead investigators on the Watergate affair a dozen years earlier. Baker had presidential aspirations himself, but realized that by taking the job chief of staff, especially in a White House spinning out of control, he would most likely never have a shot at the top job. He took chief of staff on the express understanding from Reagan that there would be no secrets and that he could clean house as he, Baker, saw fit with no interference. Reagan agreed. Baker told his own staff that he had three objectives. First, to get to the bottom of Iran-Contra. Second, to get an arms control deal with the Soviets. And third, to elect a Republican, presumably George Bush.
So essentially he was the president.
One of the first things that happened on Baker's watch was a televised address.
It's funny because, was it Ford? Something Ford, I forgot his name, but he didn't get it because...
who had been once one of the lead investigators on the Watergate affair a dozen years earlier. Baker had presidential aspirations himself, but realized that by taking the job chief of staff, especially in a White House spinning out of control, he would most likely never have a shot at the top job. He took chief of staff on the express understanding from Reagan that there would be no secrets and that he could clean house as he, Baker, saw fit with no interference. Reagan agreed. Baker told his own staff that he had three objectives. First, to get to the bottom of Iran-Contra. Second, to get an arms control deal with the Soviets. And third, to elect a Republican, presumably George Bush, president in 1988. One of the first things that happened on Baker's watch was a televised address from the Oval Office by the president. On March 4th, 1987, after months of silence, Reagan came clean on Iran-Contra. He said, quote,
"A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not. As the Tower Board reported, what began as a strategic opening to Iran deteriorated in its implementation into trading arms for hostages. This runs counter to my own beliefs, to administration policy, and to the original strategy we had in mind."
Damn, it's so easy to be an American president.
Were just getting started. On December 19th, 1986, Lawrence Walsh had been appointed by Edwin Neese independent counsel to investigate Iran-Contra, and Congress's hearings were just ramping up. Baker, in the meantime, conducted his own internal investigation in the White House. To his credit, Ronald Reagan cooperated fully. The public perception and the political perception in the halls of Congress was that Baker was cleaning house, and that Reagan was making a sincere effort to learn from his mistakes and conduct business differently going forward. This was in marked contrast to presidential responses to other scandals, Watergate and the Lewinsky scandal later, specifically. Walsh, the independent counsel, was focusing on the two most likely culprits in the mess, Oliver North and John Poindexter. As early as May 1987, he interviewed President Reagan specifically about that December 6, 1985 meeting where the Iran initiative was discussed. When asked about various things, Reagan kept repeating, "I can't remember." He was probably not stonewalling. He legitimately couldn't remember, especially when it came to details. On May 5th, 1987, the day before William Casey died of brain cancer, Congress's televised hearings on the Iran-Contra matter got underway. They dragged on through the summer of 1987. I remember seeing them on TV constantly. In July, Oliver North, the mute Marine, finally spilled what he knew or what he wanted others to think that he knew. Having been given partial immunity from prosecution, he testified that he believed Reagan knew everything about the diversion and was privy to all the operational details. He admitted he destroyed documents at the suggestion of William Casey, who, being dead, was in no position to refute it. North didn't seem to be bothered by anything that he'd done, and in fact was very proud of it. The Contra's secret war was worth it, he thought. On July 15th, it was Poindexter's turn. He claimed he had deliberately withheld knowledge of the diversion from President Reagan to give him plausible deniability. Certain points of North's and Poindexter's testimonies were refuted by copies of the prof's notes and messages, the emails, copies of which had been found on the National Security Agency's computer server by White House Communications Agency investigators. Thus, Iran-Contra was the very first political scandal that involved scandalous emails. On July 23rd, he testified about his vocal opposition to the whole arms initiative in the first place, and notably in this case, all the notes and memos that anybody could produce backed him up. Schultz had been almost forced out of the White House in November. Reagan in particular hated him, but he managed to hang on, and he told Congress that he was sure Reagan had been fed a bunch of crap by his out-of-control advisors and that he knew nothing about the diversion. Schultz remained Secretary of State until the end of Reagan's term in January 1989. Richard Secord, who ran the logistics of the Contra resupply operation, perjured himself before the committees. He told Congress he did not profit personally from the operations. In fact, he did, to the tune of $2 million. Secord later pleaded guilty to a count of lying to Congress. For all all the sound and fury of the hearings, the congressional investigations, which released their reports in November 1987, didn't add much to the public understanding of what had happened. The congressional investigation was riven with partisanship and ended up filing two reports, a majority and a minority report. The majority basically agreed with the Tower Commission. The inmates, particularly North and Poindexter, essentially had taken over the asylum, and the warden, Ronald Reagan, was asleep at the wheel. The minority report, the one from Republicans, predictably blamed the whole thing on Democrats, saying that Congress had been too strict and technical with its wording on the kind of aid it banned to the Contras. That argument didn't gain much traction, except in conservative echo chambers. The Iran-Contra affair ultimately did nothing to fix the hostage crisis that the whole arms initiative had been created to try to solve. In fact, it seems to have made things worse. In January 1987, 4 new American hostages were taken in Beirut, possibly as a result of the exposure of the deals. Another hostage was taken later.
Damn, America's such a fucking mess, dude.
What few hostages Reagan's deals had managed to free were quickly made up for by new abductions.
The fuck? They fucking
scandal
traded
so
thousands of fucking missiles for no fucking reason,
money to the Contras, buried so deep in the level of operational detail, it's tempting to dismiss the whole thing as irrelevant, at least in comparison to the harsh realities of more modern scandals. I keep bringing up the metaphor of Iran-Contra as a Rorschach test. You see in it what you want to see, and what you want to see is colored heavily by your partisan political viewpoint. Was Watergate worse? Was Clinton-Lewinsky more scandalous? Were the issues in Donald Trump's 2 impeachments deeper and more fundamental than whatever was at stake in Iran-Contra? It's tempting to say yes, and to dismiss this old 1980s scandal as quaint and irrelevant. Times have changed in 35 years. But I don't think we can dismiss it. It's worth a few words to try to understand why. It is important, and it matters. The biggest issue at stake in Iran-Contra was constitutional legitimacy. Several of the participants in the affair, especially Secretary of State George Shultz, made this argument at the time. Yes, the United States Constitution gives the president basic powers of conducting foreign policy, but the Constitution is explicit, and it goes out of its way to specify that the power of appropriations, of funding, lies with Congress, specifically the House of Representatives. When the Constitution was created in Philadelphia in 1787, its framers were careful to separate the powers among the various branches of government and departments within those branches. Congress was given the power to tax and to raise money directly, a power it had lacked under the Articles of Confederation. But the check on that power was that taxation and appropriation powers resided in the House, the legislative chamber that was thought closest and most accountable to the people. When Congress passed the Boland Amendment in 1982 prohibiting military aid to the Contras, the powers of the executive branch were checked. However much Ronald Reagan or Oliver North disagreed with that decision, they were bound by it. Congress did not want American taxpayer money going to fund a war, a secret war in Central America. The Boland Amendment was attached to the Defense Appropriations Act, which Reagan signed on December 21st, 1982. He accepted it. It was law. What North and Poindexter did was to make an end run around the Boland Amendment. They took government property, paid for by the taxpayers, and sold it to a foreign power, Iran. The money the government took from that sale, it gave illegally to a foreign army. This was not a covert operation in the traditional sense. Congress does fund covert operations by the CIA and others. The CIA submits a proposed budget and often doesn't tell Congress what it's spending taxpayer dollars on. That may seem sketchy, but it is legal, and it is constitutional. Iran-Contra, though, wasn't that. This was not part of a black budget, appropriated however blindly and spent however craftily by CIA bureaucrats. This was a sale of U.S. government property to fund an illegal war. All of
That's insane,
money
dude.
diverted to the Contras belonged to Iran. At one point, George Bush made a similar argument. But that argument is wrong. Once Iran gave money to the United States, whether in exchange for weapons or as a donation or a bribe, that became federal money subject to appropriation by Congress. Conversely, the executive branch in the form of the NSC couldn't just take what it wanted from public coffers and give it to a foreign power. Even if the Boland Amendment wasn't in the picture, that would still be true. The way that North evidently found to be able to live with himself, telling himself that the cause of the Contras was so important that it was justifiable to disregard the laws against it, doesn't ring true. For one thing, the Contras were themselves terrorists, associated with numerous atrocities and human rights violations. They were never able to shake the public perception that they were funded by drug trafficking. But even aside from that issue, the claim that supporting the Contras was so vital that it justified overriding the basic fabric of the Constitution was simply an appeal to authority, Ronald Reagan's authority. If a leader can do no wrong, if his judgment is or should be law simply because it's his, that gets us dangerously close to the crime that the insurrectionists at the Capitol on January 6, 2021 were trying to commit. That is, the subjugation of the constitutional order and the rule of law to the will, and indeed the whim, of a single man. In a democratic society, there must be accountability. There must be checks and balances. Yes, there are unjust laws and unwise laws, but democracies tamper with constitutional checks and balances at their hazard.
Okay, so Iran wasn't really as involved as I thought it was.
Why did he destroy documents? Why did he take the Fifth Amendment for so long? Why did he?
Because at some point Israel wasn't even involved in the
why did Poindexter work so hard to keep
making the deals with Iran.
Reagan, he was a master politician. He could handle politics.
I mean,
he needed no help from North.
Israel was the one who,
stuffing documents into
you know,
house. Like him or hate him, Ronald Reagan
brought
was
up the
ill-served
idea,
by
though.
his servants. Whatever anybody's political stripe, in 1987, almost everyone could agree on that. Iran-Contra had a very long tail. This video could be half as long again as it already is if I went into great detail, so we're going to tie up the loose ends as concisely as possible. Oliver North was indicted in 16 felony counts of various crimes related to Iran-Contra. In May 1989, he was convicted of 3 of those counts, including lying to Congress and destroying evidence. The problem, at least for the government, was that he had received partial immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony to Congress in 1987, and his immunized testimony may have tainted the trial. His conviction was vacated in 1990. The next year,
Insane. He just walked
John
away.
Poindexter was also indicted and convicted of similar crimes. And very similar to North's case, his conviction was also questioned as a result of the role of congressional testimony for which he had been immunized, at least partially, in 1987. Poindexter's convictions were reversed on appeal in 1991. Robert McFarland pleaded guilty in 1988 to misdemeanor charges for lying to Congress. He got 2 years of probation and a fine.
Wow.
Richard Secord pleaded guilty 2 years of probation and a fine.
The fuck?
Richard Secord pleaded guilty 1989, lying to Congress, sentenced 2 years probation. Numerous others involved in the scandal were indicted, some convicted, some pled guilty, people like Elliot Abrams, Dwayne Claridge, Thomas Kleins, etc. I have elected not to focus on them just to try to keep this story from becoming so unwieldy with characters. George Bush, the vice president, was never able to shake the specter of Iran-Contra. It hung like a dark shadow over his own run for president in 1988.
Yeah, I'm surprised he got the presidency.
Criminal indictments for the principals were just ramping up. Bush had been briefed several times on the Iran arms initiative, most notably in July 1986 by Amiran Nir, an Israeli official involved on Israel's side of the deal.
That's what I'm saying.
Evidence indicates that Bush generally approved of the arms deals with Iran, and he may have had a greater understanding of their scope and purpose than President Reagan did. But again, as with Reagan, evidence is lacking when it comes to knowledge of the diversion of funds to the Contras. Iran-Contra did not catch fire as a campaign issue, perhaps in part because
I kind of want to think about like what parts of this story is propaganda, what parts of do you guys think like Israel genuinely stopped being involved in major parts of it? Or do you guys think like Israel was involved in like continued to staying involved in it and it's just like it's just not mentioned. It's Bale. Ha. Sen yatay. اوکی خب من نیم ساعت دادم البته خب ساعت 11 نه اوکی پس
his Democratic opponent in 1988
20 دقیقه داد yeah people are trying to sleep and I'm fucking still streaming lol okay I'm gonna stop the stream here. I don't want to ruin people's sleep, you know. But yeah, on the next episode of the stream, we'll go through what parts of this is propaganda, what parts of it isn't propaganda. Because I don't trust that Israel wasn't involved the whole time. That's kind of sketchy. They're always involved when there's Iran in the picture. Anyways, thanks for coming onto the stream. Please leave a follow to be notified when I'm streaming again, and have a great day. Khuda Hafiz.